Okay, so we've talked about the Hebrew scriptures. Now we're going to talk about the second of the big three monotheistic faiths, Christianity. And so I've got a little guide to some of the stuff that we're reading from the New Testament. So I'll first talk a little bit about the history of the document that we call the New Testament and these things that we call Gospels, and then I'll get into some more specifics about the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles. You've got to read the readings online, but I think it's the first 12 chapters of Luke and like the first 8 chapters of Acts. So I'll give you all the information you need to get through that kind of stuff. The first thing that is really important to remember is that Christianity begins as this fringe movement of Jewish people who are upset about the way that Judaism has sort of shaken out. So I don't know, I think it's kind of unfair to call it like a cult, but it kind of is kind of culty. Jesus himself was a Jew, and he was a Jew when he was born, and he was a Jew when he died. So the intent of early Christians was not to like establish a new religion. It was actually just to reform Judaism as it stood. So that's one thing to think about. As you're also looking at these texts, the other thing to remember is that Christianity spreads across the Roman Empire super, super quickly. Why do you think it has the mass appeal that it does? Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the Roman Empire is full of slaves, and Christianity is really appealing to people who are marginalized. Christianity, we'll see, is also really appealing to women. So the fact that it is able to appeal to sort of a broad sector of the population bodes really well for how fast it spreads as a religion. So let's talk a little bit about the Gospels. There are 4 of them. There are 4 total Gospels, but we typically talk about them in 2 different categories. So you have the Synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic just means seen together, and the Synoptic Gospels tell a pretty similar story of the life and times of Jesus Christ, who obviously is the main prophet of Christianity. I love the word gospel. It's one of my favorite words. It comes from the Greek word evangelion, which actually means good news. Like literally translated, the word gospel means good news. So it's one of my favorite words. I think it's really cool. Now, the composition of the Gospels is it's sort of a complicated topic. So it's generally believed that Mark was the first of the written Gospels, and that the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke both used Mark as a source for their own Gospels. So the picture I have on this slide is a picture. It's actually really it's outdated because we don't accept the 2-source hypothesis anymore. We accept the 4-source hypothesis. So the biblical scholarship now does confirm that there was another source as well that we don't have. We don't have this source. We refer to it as Q. It probably existed contemporaneously with Mark, and Luke and Matthew used Q as a source for their Gospels. There's no evidence that Mark knew about Q, however. The source Q, we refer to it as the sayings of Jesus, and like I said, we don't have the document anymore, so it's just kind of been reproduced in different spots. There are some things that Jesus says in Q that we can sort of trace back to this document that must have existed at one time. But so now actually what we're dealing with is a 4-source hypothesis. So Matthew and Luke each had their own separate sources too. So if you Luke, we just refer to L as an independent source that Luke used, and M as an independent source that Mark used. I can put a diagram on Blackboard too, because I think that would make things a little more clearer. There used to be one in the textbook that we used to use. So 4 sources total influenced the writings of the Synoptic Gospels. at least Matthew and Luke. So if Mark is the first one, when was Mark composed? Well, we date it anywhere from about 64 to 68 CE. And if you want to put that into a little bit of perspective, the date of the crucifixion of Christ is estimated to be around the year 30. So we're talking at least 34 years after the death of Jesus that this text is compiled. So that's one thing to consider when we're talking about this literature, that the authors who are composing this stuff, it's dubious about whether or not they were there. When we look at Luke and Matthew, their authorship, there's such a variation with scholars. It's dated anywhere from 70 to 100 CE. Luke is listed typically as the third gospel. We call the author of Luke, we refer to him as Luke, the physician. He's traditionally identified as a doctor. We think he was a Gentile. We think he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, which, by the way, Paul is not one of the original 12 apostles, so we refer to him as an apostle, but he's not. But otherwise, we don't know a lot about the author of Luke. We do, however, attribute the authorship of Acts of the Apostles to the same writer, so I'll talk about that one in a little bit. The purpose of the Gospels is to provide a narrative of the life of Jesus. And some people look at the Gospels as sort of a biographical account, that they provide these sort of biographical sketches of Jesus' life and his ministry. Other people take like a more symbolic view of the Gospels and argue that they're supposed to function more like a mythology that's full of symbols that intend to support Christian beliefs and practices. My interpretation is probably the latter, right? That it's way more than a biographical sketch. There's information contained in the Gospels that seems really superfluous in a biography. So I don't know, but that's up for grabs, certainly. There are differences between the Gospels, right? So if you look at Matthew and Luke are pretty similar, but Mark is pretty different from those two, because Mark actually doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus. Mark begins with his baptism as an adult. He's like almost 30, and John the Baptist baptizes him, and then it tells about his ministry in Galilee and concludes with the trial, judgment, passion, and resurrection. They all conclude that way. If you look at the Gospel of John, which is that non-synoptic gospel, that includes like this totally different chronology of Jesus' ministry. A lot of the narrative details are different, so that is a really unique text. Scholars have for a long time sort of struggled with how to interpret the Gospel of John. So there's that too. My best guess from all the research I've done is to date Luke at around 85. But all we know for sure is that it was composed sometime after the composition of the Gospel of Mark. The cool thing about Luke, though, is, and that's why I think this Gospel is so fun to read, is that Luke is able to write in a bunch of different literary styles. And that's really significant because it means that people from all backgrounds can sort of arrive at the text and pull something out of it despite not being like privy to some of the same information. So people from different social backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds could find some kind of overall familiarity in the account based on the different styles of writing that are being employed. And that's like your window. That's a window into the story of Jesus in the gospel. So that's the cool thing about Luke's gospel are the styles. The basic story is the same. So Jesus appears, he ministers in Galilee, he moves to Judea and Jerusalem, he encounters deadly hostility that leads to his suffering, death, and resurrection. If you were going to do the plot synopsis of every single gospel ever, it's basically this, right? Luke is kind of unique and this is why Luke is my favorite gospel, because the emphasis in this one is really on the compassion, the compassionate aspect of Jesus' ministry, the way that he lives his life among people that we would call marginal members of society, right? The sinners and the tax collectors and the poor people, the women, the oppressed. Luke shows Jesus interacting with these people really often, and I don't know. I think that's, in my personal vision of Christianity, I think that's what's really important. So that's you see a lot of that in Luke, which is great. I'll stop this one here, and then for the next lecture, I will give you sort of an outline of Luke, and then we'll keep talking about some things to look for in the gospel.